The fever came at night. It always came at night. Vera had learned to expect it the way she had learned to expect winter. Inevitable, consuming, and indifferent to how well she had prepared herself against it. She would be measuring dried herbs by candlelight, or grinding root bark into fine powder, and then the heat would rise through her skin from somewhere impossibly deep, as though her very bones had caught fire from the inside out. The healers of Arenthus had no explanation for it. She had not told them everything, of course. She had not told them when it started, or what she had been doing in the precise moment the first flame ignited beneath her ribs. She had not told them about the western corridor of the Thornspire, or the night 3 months ago when she had been carrying a basket of medicinal supplies and rounded a corner she had absolutely no business rounding. She had not told anyone about the man she had seen. Vera pressed her palms flat against the stone work table and breathed through the wave of heat that rolled through her body, threatening to buckle her knees entirely. Around her, the lower healing ward hummed with its usual midnight quiet. Other apprentices sleeping on their narrow cots, the senior healer Pella snoring softly behind the privacy screen at the far end of the room, the distant percussion of rain against the high-arched windows. No one stirred. No one ever stirred when the fever came. It left no visible mark on her. No sweat, no flushing, no elevated pulse that anyone else could measure. Whatever burned inside her burned clean, which was precisely why every explanation had run out so quickly. Bone fever, Pella had suggested first, with the unshakable confidence of a woman who had diagnosed ailments for 4 decades and believed she had encountered every variety the world had to offer. Then dream sickness, then a spiritual imbalance requiring meditation and fasting, a recommendation that Vera had pretended enthusiastically to follow while secretly eating her meals behind the herb drying room where no one thought to look. None of the diagnoses had fit. None of the remedies had worked. And Vera had stopped volunteering new symptoms for their consideration because explaining the fever honestly meant explaining everything else. The way it intensified when she crossed the eastern courtyard. The way it subsided when she moved to the outermost reaches of the castle grounds, putting stone and distance between herself and whatever its source was. The way it had blazed so ferociously 3 days ago that she had nearly dropped a boiling kettle from hands gone suddenly useless. And she had looked up from the window in that precise moment to see a procession crossing the yard below her. The Alpha King's procession. Vera's fingers tightened against the edge of the table. His name was Calder. Every wolf in Arenthus knew his name the way they knew the name of the moon. Something vast and inevitable that governed the rhythms of their lives without ever drawing close enough to be truly known. He ruled from the Thornspire with a reputation built on precision and severity, a king who had consolidated 3 fractured and warring territories into a single realm through a combination of iron negotiation and the kind of quiet, absolute power that never needed to raise its voice to be obeyed. She had seen him once. Properly seen him, not the distant ceremonial figure glimpsed at official proceedings that all castle residents encountered occasionally. 3 months ago, in that corridor she had no business being in, with her basket of willow bark and her mind fully occupied with the supply inventory she had been composing in her head. He had been alone, unusual for a king. He had been reading a document as he walked, a habit she would later learn was characteristic of him, and when he looked up to avoid colliding with her, their eyes had met across 18 inches of torchlit corridor stone. She could not describe what had happened in that moment. Even now, alone in the midnight healing ward with the fever crackling through her chest, she could not find language sufficient for it. It was not simply attraction, though she was not blind to the precise considered architecture of his face. It was not fear, though every rational instinct she possessed screamed that she was a common-born apprentice healer who had just stumbled into the direct path of the most powerful wolf in 3 known territories. It was recognition. As if something ancient and deeply buried inside her blood had lurched violently awake and said, with absolute certainty, There. He had looked at her for 3 full seconds. She had counted afterward, with the obsessive helplessness of someone cataloging the exact sequence of a disaster. Then his expression had closed, like a door being quietly but firmly shut, and he had continued down the corridor without a word, without a backward glance, without any acknowledgement that anything of consequence had just occurred. She had stood motionless in that corridor for a long time after he disappeared from sight. The fever had started that same night. Vera released a slow, deliberate breath and reached for the mortar she had abandoned, forcing her hands back to their assigned work. She was an apprentice healer with no family name worth recording in any document, no bloodline that appeared in Arenthus's genealogical records, and no wolf form. A rarity that had made her childhood marked by careful endurance and her adult life defined by the discipline of invisibility. She had worked for 3 years to earn her place in the Thornspire's healing ward. She had no intention of dismantling that place by entertaining thoughts that had no legitimate claim to exist in her mind. Whatever had happened in that corridor was nothing. Whatever burned in her chest every night was nothing. She repeated this to herself with the dedication of someone who understood that repetition could eventually become truth if applied with sufficient conviction. From somewhere deep in the castle above her, a bell began to toll. Vera's head lifted from her work. The bell that rang at midnight in the Thornspire had one meaning and one meaning only. It was not the fire bell, which rang in rapid triple succession. It was not the watch bell, which struck in measured single tones on the quarter hour. This was the summons bell. Slow, resonant, final. Every wolf in the castle would already be stirring, pulling on cloaks, moving toward the great ceremonial hall where proclamations were made and alliances were sealed, and the direction of the realm was declared to those who served within its ancient walls. Vera's fever blazed with sudden violent intensity that drove the breath from her lungs. She pressed one hand hard against her sternum, gasping at the force of it. Something was happening tonight, something that her body already understood, and her mind had not yet been permitted to know. She set down the mortar with careful hands, reached for her cloak on the hook by the door, and went to find out what it was. The great ceremonial hall of the Thornspire had not been opened in 7 years. Vera knew this because Pella had told her once, the older woman's voice carrying a reverence she normally reserved for the most potent of remedies and the oldest of the healing texts. The last time those iron-braced doors had swung wide, the previous Alpha had transferred the full weight of his power in a ceremony so resonant with ancient bond magic that 3 wolves in attendance had lost consciousness from the force of it alone. Tonight, the hall burned with the light of 100 iron lanterns, and every shadow they cast was the shadow of consequence. Vera found the position she had no right to occupy. A narrow service gallery above the main floor, accessible through a maintenance passage she had discovered during her first winter at the Thornspire, when she had been searching for a place to read undisturbed. She pressed herself against the carved stone balustrade and looked down at what had assembled below. The hall held every ranking wolf in Arenthus. Their formal house colors formed a living tapestry of alliance and ambition across the floor, shifting and murmuring with the suppressed energy of people who had been kept waiting long enough to become impatient. She recognized Lord Dravath's silver and black immediately. It clustered near the front of the assembly with the settled confidence of those who already knew the outcome of tonight's proceedings and had arranged their expressions accordingly. House Dravath. The name settled in her stomach like a swallowed stone. Lord Dravath controlled the eastern territories and 3 mountain passes that Arenthus could not afford to cede to rival powers. He had a daughter, Valdis, whose silver-white hair and her father's political hunger were equally famous throughout the kingdom, who had been positioned near the Alpha King at every official function for the past 2 years, with the deliberate patience of a chess piece being advanced one calculated square at a time. Everyone in the castle had been expecting this night. Everyone, apparently, except Vera, who had been too occupied with maintaining the careful architecture of her own denial to notice the political landscape shifting beneath her feet. Calder stood on the raised platform at the hall's far end. Even from this height, even surrounded by the massed wolves of 3 consolidated territories, he commanded the space in a way that had nothing to do with the elevation of the platform beneath him. He wore the formal deep gray of the Alpha House, and his face in the lantern light was wrong. Vera felt the word arrive with physical weight. She had seen his face once, for 3 seconds in a torchlit corridor, and she had memorized it with the involuntary thoroughness of someone who had spent 3 subsequent months trying with great determination not to think about it. She knew the precise quality of his stillness, the deliberate economy of his expressions, the contained energy quality of a person who was never absent, only watchful. Tonight, the stillness was different. Tonight, it was empty. As if the person she had encountered in that corridor had been replaced by a replica that wore his face without comprehension of what the expressions it produced were supposed to mean. The hallmaster's voice rang out across the assembled wolves, announcing the formal terms of the bonding declaration between the Alpha House and House Dravath. The territorial provisions, the political implications, the long history of alliance between the bloodlines, which had apparently been longer and more orchestrated than anyone had previously acknowledged publicly. Vera heard the words from a great distance, as though sound itself had become reluctant to reach her. Her eyes remained on Calder's face. She watched it with the focused attention of a healer reading symptoms, looking not for what was present but for what should have been present and was inexplicably absent. The micro-expressions that preceded genuine decision, the way a person held their shoulders when they were choosing something rather than enduring it. The aliveness behind the eyes that distinguished a man from a performance of a man. She found none of it. Her fever reached a pitch she had never experienced. It was not the warm, persistent burn of the past 3 months. This was sharp and tearing, as if something with deep roots inside her chest was being extracted by force, slowly, without care for what it damaged on the way out. She bit down hard on the inside of her lip to silence herself, her hand finding the stone balustrade and gripping it until the edge cut into her palm. The pain helped her stay present. Below, Valdis ascended the platform steps in a gown that caught and redirected lantern light with the precision of a weapon designed for exactly that effect. She was beautiful in the way of things engineered to be seen and remembered, deliberate, composed, every detail calibrated for maximum impression. She looked up at Calder as she reached him with an expression of settled, satisfied triumph that she made no effort whatsoever to conceal, because there was no one present whose opinion she feared enough to moderate herself for. Calder reached for her hand. The movement was mechanical. Wrong in the nameable way that Vera's healer's instincts recognized immediately. The fluid, economical grace she had registered in that single corridor encounter was entirely absent, replaced by the lurching, imprecise compliance of someone executing instructions received from outside, rather than decisions arising from within. He raised Valdis's hand. He spoke the words of the formal declaration. His voice was hollow as a bell struck by something that was not a hammer. The hall responded with an eruption that shook the gallery where Vera stood. The thunder of stamping feet, the howls of territorial satisfaction from the houses whose strategic interests had just been secured. The orchestrated performance of collective approval that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with the consolidation of power. Vera could not move. The pain in her chest had passed beyond the category of physical sensation into something that did not have a clinical name in any of the healing texts she had studied. It was the agony of watching something that some wordless part of you has recognized as yours be formally transferred to someone else. And she had no standing to feel it. No claim that any reasonable person would validate. No explanation that would not reduce her immediately to the figure of a nobody apprentice who had constructed an entire interior cathedral around 3 seconds of accidental eye contact. She felt the tears on her face before she had registered the decision to cry. Below, Calder stood with Valdis's hand raised in his and looked at nothing with eyes that had stopped being his. And Vera understood, with a clarity that arrived with the cruelty of revelations that come precisely when they can no longer help you, exactly what her fever had been trying to tell her for 3 months. She released the balustrade. She walked back through the maintenance passage with the careful, mechanical steadiness of someone who has decided that falling apart is a luxury available only after reaching a location where no one will witness it. She made it to the stairwell before her legs gave out. She sat on the cold stone steps for a long time with her arms wrapped around herself and the fever burning like a brand against her ribs and the sound of celebration echoing up through the thorn spire's ancient walls. Then she stood up, walked to her chamber, and began to pack what little she owned. She was through the thorn spire's servant gate before the first hour of morning, swallowed by a darkness that felt, for the first time in 3 months, like something she had chosen rather than something that had chosen her. She did not go to Caldmere directly. In the first 3 weeks after leaving the Thornspire, she moved with the deliberate caution of someone who understood that the most dangerous time for a fugitive is the earliest, when the search is freshest and the searchers most motivated. She spent 4 days in a market town called Vethrun, sleeping in a traveler's inn under a borrowed name, giving the initial wave of any search time to pass over her. Then 10 days moving westward through smaller settlements, offering her healer's skills in exchange for meals and a night's shelter, never staying long enough to become notable. Then she heard from a wool merchant at a valley crossing about the village of Caldmere at the edge of the Grey Vale forest, and the healer who had died there the previous autumn and left her cottage standing empty. She arrived in Caldmere on the coldest night of what remained of winter with a pack on her back, a false name assembled and ready on her tongue, and a secret she had been carrying since before she ran. Her name, she told the village elder who met her at the gate, with a raised lantern and the measured suspicion of a woman responsible for the well-being of everyone behind her, was Mira, a widow, a trained healer. Someone looking for a quiet place to rebuild after a quiet tragedy she preferred not to discuss in detail. The elder, whose own name was Bryn, had studied her for a long, unhurried moment, taking in the competent set of her hands and the hollowed quality of her eyes and the careful steadiness of someone holding their interior architecture together through will alone, and then stepped aside without further interrogation to let her through the gate. The cottage was cold, dust-covered, and exactly adequate to what she needed. Mira, spent her first week in Caldmere, cleaning and restocking the herb stores, with what she had carried and what the forest edge provided for those who knew where and how to look. She introduced herself to the village with the combination of demonstrable skill and quiet, personal reticence she had learned across years of castle life was the most reliable formula for being accepted without being examined too closely. She delivered a difficult and dangerous birth in her second week and saved both mother and child through a night that the family would later describe to everyone who would listen. After that, Caldmere stopped watching her with careful suspicion and started watching her with the warmth that communities reserve for people who have proven themselves genuinely necessary. She tried to receive this warmth with gratitude and let it be enough. She woke every morning before dawn and lay in the narrow bed in the dead healer's cottage and pressed her hands flat against the space below her ribs and breathed with deliberate slowness through the burn that had taken up permanent residence there. It had changed in quality since she left the Thorn Spire. The sharp, tearing agony of that night in the gallery had settled into something duller and more constant, a deep, pulsing heat that radiated outward in rhythms she had eventually, after resisting the knowledge for as long as she could maintain the resistance, recognized as something distinct from her own heartbeat. It was not her pulse. It was something answering hers, something searching. She did not permit herself to think too carefully about what that meant. She had become expert at the precise application of not thinking about things, and she employed this skill with disciplined regularity. The days of her new life developed their own careful architecture. Morning rounds to assess the sick and elderly of Caldmere. Afternoons dedicated to preparation of remedies and management of the steady stream of villagers who arrived at her door carrying ailments of the body and, increasingly, problems that had no physical location and everything to do with the suffering that comes from being human and alive. Evenings alone, working by candlelight, keeping her hands in motion so her mind had less room to wander eastward, toward the thorn spire, toward him. She had known since before she ran. That was the truth she handled with the most disciplined distance, the knowledge that had been sitting in her chest since 2 weeks before the ceremony, 2 weeks during which she had rehearsed daily how she would tell him, what words she would choose, how to say it in a way that communicated everything she wanted it to communicate. Then the summons bell had rung, then the gallery, then the cold stairwell. She had arrived in Caldmere knowing. She had unpacked her herbs and introduced herself to Bryn and delivered the blacksmith's wife's child and brewed remedies for coughs and set broken bones. All of it knowing. She had told herself the daily work was enough. That purpose was an adequate replacement for everything she had walked away from. She had been in Caldmere for 6 weeks, when the physical reality made it impossible to continue insulating herself from the full weight of what she carried. The nausea was not a revelation. The nausea was simply her body's announcement that it would no longer be ignored while she attended to everyone else. Vera sat in her chair that evening with her hands in her lap and let herself think, fully and without the careful management she had been applying to everything, about what she was carrying, his child. Growing inside her while he had stood in the great hall with Valdis's hand raised in his, and spoken words that had not been his. She sat with it for a long time. Then she pressed her palms against her stomach, and made herself a promise she intended to keep. Whatever this world required her to be, it would have to allow her to be a mother first. Winter deepened around Caldmere. The forest pressed closer. The days shortened to the point where darkness felt less like the absence of light and more like the natural state of things, with light appearing briefly as an exception. Vera worked. She healed. She kept her face arranged in the expression of a woman at peace with a quiet life. At night, she lay awake with one hand on her stomach and felt the answering pulse of something that was not her heartbeat, and she did not let herself follow that pulse back to its source. She was, she told herself, invisible. She was safe. She was unremarkable in every way that mattered to people with power. She believed this completely. Right up until the morning, a trader's cart rolled through Caldmere's gate with news from the capital that dismantled every carefully constructed certainty she had built her new life upon. The trader's name was Aldous, and he had the energy of a man who had been carrying an extraordinary story for 3 days and was now physically incapable of delivering it at anything less than full volume. He set up at the center of Caldmere's small market square with his cart of salted provisions and bolts of winter cloth, and within 20 minutes had drawn a crowd of sufficient size to satisfy his need for an audience. Vera heard him from the far end of the lane, where she was returning from a morning visit to Old Farek, an elderly patient with a chest infection that was beginning to respond, finally, to the thyme and elderberry preparation she had been adjusting for 2 weeks. She heard the name first. Calder. She stopped walking. It was not a conscious decision. Her body simply ceased forward motion the way a pulled thread pulls everything attached to it, and she stood in the frozen mud of Caldmere's eastern lane with her basket on her arm and her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and listened. Aldous was in full performance now, his voice pitched to carry, his gestures broad and emphatic. The Alpha King, he was telling the assembled villagers, had not accepted the bonding declaration. A murmur moved through the crowd. Vera moved closer without registering that she was doing it. The morning after the ceremony in the Thornspire's Great Hall, Aldous continued. The Alpha King had woken in a state that none of his attendants had ever witnessed in him before. Disoriented, volatile, demanding explanations for events he apparently had no recollection of participating in. He had refused to allow Valdis into his private chambers, had refused to acknowledge the witness declaration as binding, had stood before his council in the gray morning light and stated flatly, in terms that allowed no ambiguity, that whatever had occurred in that hall the previous night was not a choice he had made. The council, according to Aldous, had not received this well. Lord Drevath is furious, Aldous said, with the relish of someone who found the fury of powerful people enormously entertaining from a safe distance. His daughter is technically the declared mate of the Alpha King, witness before the entire assembled nobility, and the king himself is walking around, refusing to acknowledge it happened. They say he hasn't slept since. They say he's deployed wolves to every territory from the northern peaks to the southern coast. Searching for what? Someone in the crowd asked. Aldous spread his hands wide. Someone. A woman, according to the rumors. No one in the capital knows who she is. Only that he won't stop. Only that the man who built this kingdom on the foundation of iron self-control has come completely apart at the seams. And House Drevath is screaming treason, and the eastern territories are restless. And the wolves across 3 regions have been running in patterns that the old trackers say they've never seen before. He paused for effect, clearly aware of his timing. They say the crops in the Thornspire Valley have begun to fail. They say 3 packs in the Midlands have gone feral without explanation. They say whatever is wrong with the king is spreading outward through the bond network like rot through timber, and if someone doesn't find this woman soon, there may not be much of a kingdom left to worry about. The crowd absorbed this with the combined energy of people for whom distant political catastrophe was simultaneously deeply concerning and thoroughly riveting. Vera was no longer listening. She had turned and walked back down the eastern lane without conscious awareness of doing so, her feet carrying her home on their own recognizance, while the rest of her stood very still inside her own chest and tried to process what she had just heard. He had not accepted it. He had woken with no memory of the declaration. He was searching, destroying everything, tearing his kingdom apart, refusing to sleep, searching for her. The realization arrived not with triumph, but with grief, deep and complicated and edged with something she could not name cleanly. She had spent weeks telling herself the wound would scar over. That absence was its own kind of protection, that she had made peace with what the gallery had shown her. She had made peace with a lie. And now the lie was gone, and the wound beneath it was entirely fresh. The fever in her ribs, which had settled into its customary dull, constant burn over the past weeks, pulsed suddenly with an intensity that stopped her mid-step, one hand flying to her sternum. It was not painful. It was oriented, directional. Whatever had been searching in the dark without a compass had suddenly acquired one and was turning toward true north with a certainty that made the air feel different. She pressed her hand hard against the warmth beneath her ribs and stood in the empty lane and told herself, with great firmness, that this changed nothing. She was safe in Caldmere. She was invisible. No one was looking for a widow healer named Mira at the edge of the Greyvale forest. She repeated this to herself all the way home and was still repeating it when she opened her cottage door, stepped inside, and found a stranger sitting at her work table. The stranger was a man somewhere past 40, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of deliberate responsibility rather than simple age. He was lean and precise in his movements, and he held himself with a stillness that Vera had learned to recognize as belonging to wolves who had spent decades in service to someone powerful. The stillness of a person who had subordinated their own presence so thoroughly to their purpose that it had become indistinguishable from composure. He did not reach for a weapon when she entered. He did not stand. He simply looked at her with eyes the color of winter bark and said, with the measured calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times, "Vera, my name is Rovik. I am First Beta to Calder, Alpha King of Arenthus. I have been looking for you for 11 weeks. The basket dropped from her arm without her permission. You have made a mistake, she heard herself say, with a steadiness that had no organic basis whatsoever. My name is Mira. I am a healer. I have never been to the Thornspire. Rovik looked at her with the patient expression of someone who had anticipated this response and found it entirely understandable. You have a burn scar on your right wrist from a copper pot that overturned in the lower healing ward during your first month as an apprentice. Pella treated it with calendula and scolded you for reaching across an open flame. You have been in this village for 8 weeks, arriving near the coldest point of winter, and in that time you have not spoken to a single person about where you came from or what drove you here. Vera did not move. The king, Rovik continued, has described you in detail to every trusted wolf in 3 territories. It was only a matter of time before someone recognized the description. I came with minimal escort, 2 wolves stationed outside your door. I wanted to minimize alarm, which is why I came in alone. His voice remained steady. What I have to tell you needs to be said without witnesses. The fever was blazing now, full and insistent, the way it only blazed when... She cut the thought off and forced herself to pick up the basket and set it on the nearest surface and breathe. Say what you came to say, she said. Rovik reached into the interior of his coat and produced a small glass vial stopped with wax. He set it on the work table between them. This was recovered from the ceremonial preparation room of the Thornspire 3 days after the bonding declaration. It was found behind a loose stone in the wall beside the wine preparation alcove, wrapped in cloth bearing House Dravath's servant livery. His voice remained even, but something behind his eyes was not. The compound inside took our healers 4 weeks to identify. It is derived from the root of the deep silver plant, combined with 3 additional elements we are still working to name. In sufficient concentration, introduced into wine or food, it suppresses a wolfsbond instincts completely. It severs the connection between what the wolf knows and what the man does. The person continues to function, continues to speak, to move, to respond to external instruction. He paused. But they are not present. They are absent from themselves, making no choices because they are incapable of choice. Vera stared at the vial. The glass was dark, but she could see the faint residue of something along its inner surface, something that had no color she could name precisely. He was drugged, she said. The words came out flat, as if her voice could not yet accommodate what her mind was beginning to accept. He was violated, Rovik said quietly, and the word landed in the cold cottage air with the weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be said correctly. The declaration he made that night was not his. The hand he extended to Valdis was not moved by his will. Whatever you witnessed in that hall, Vera, it was not him choosing another. It was House Dravath using his body to secure a political outcome they could not have achieved through any legitimate means. The silence in the cottage was absolute. Vera sat down. Not a choice. Her legs simply completed a decision her body made on her behalf. He woke 3 mornings after the ceremony with no memory of it, Rovik continued. The compound had fully metabolized by then. He remembered everything up to the moment the ceremonial wine was poured, and nothing after, until he found himself sitting in the Alpha's council chamber with Valdis installed in the adjacent suite, and 11 signed copies of a bonding declaration bearing what was apparently his signature. Something inside Vera's chest was fracturing along lines she had spent weeks reinforcing. He came to the lower healing ward first, Rovik said. Before the council, before the guard, before anyone. He went directly to your chamber. She closed her eyes. When he found it empty, Rovik stopped, began again. I have served Calder since he was 17 years old. I have never seen him afraid of anything. Not territory disputes, not assassination attempts, not the full political weight of 3 noble houses assembled against him. He looked at her steadily. He was afraid that morning. He has been afraid every morning since. Vera pressed both hands flat against her thighs and looked at the vial on the table and breathed carefully. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Why come to me rather than simply tell him where I am?" Rovik withdrew a folded piece of paper from his coat and placed it beside the vial. "Because this arrived at the Thornspire 4 days ago, intercepted by one of our people inside House Dravath's correspondence network." She unfolded it. The handwriting was precise and cold. The message was brief. "The complication has been located. Elimination to occur before the dark moon. Lord Dravath sends his regards to the problem that refused to stay solved." The dark moon was in 6 days. "How many?" Vera asked, and was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "We don't know," Rovik said. "Which is why The sharp, distinct cry of a bird cut through the cottage wall from outside. 3 short calls, precisely spaced. Then silence. Rovik was on his feet before the 3rd call finished. His eyes had gone the flat, focused amber of a wolf with a threat in its sightline. "That is my signal," he said. "They are already here." They had not come through the village. That was the first thing Rovik established, moving to the window with a precision that made no sound at all despite the speed of it. He scanned the tree line with the practiced efficiency of someone reading terrain rather than looking at it, and what he saw in the Greyvale Forest's outermost edge made him draw back from the glass with an expression Vera did not need experience reading to interpret correctly. "The eastern approach is covered," he said, his voice dropping to the low register of professional urgency. "They came through the forest and circled. They have been in position since before dawn." "Before you arrived," Vera said. "Before I arrived." His jaw tightened fractionally. "Which means they tracked me here, or they found you through a different route entirely, and I led them to your door regardless of which." He turned from the window. "I have 2 wolves outside. Good wolves. Experienced. But I counted 4 shapes in the eastern tree line, and there will be more I could not see." Vera stood up from the chair and went directly to the work table. She did not go for a weapon. She began moving jars with the rapid, organized calm of a person who had been mentally cataloging a workspace for 8 weeks, precisely against a moment when calm, organized speed would matter. She found the foxglove tincture, the concentrated wolfsbane derivative she kept in the locked box under the table for wound treatment, the iron-capped vials of paralytic compound she had prepared for large animal sedation. "What are you doing?" Rovik asked. "Preparing." She selected 3 vials, assessed them, pocketed 2, and discarded 1. "What I do not have is a weapon I know how to use against trained hunters. What I do have is 8 weeks of preparation in a fully stocked healing cottage, and a thorough understanding of what various compounds do to the physiology of a shifted wolf at close range." Rovik looked at her for 1 second with an expression that, in other circumstances, she might have identified as respect. Then he reached inside his coat and produced a short blade with a silver-edged grip. "Take this as well," he said. "The edge won't kill them, but it will slow a shifted wolf long enough to matter. Aim for the shoulder joint if you can manage it." Vera took the blade. It was heavier than she expected. She adjusted her grip and found a hold that felt stable. From outside came a sound she could not immediately categorize. Then she identified it, the percussive thud of a body being moved at speed against a hard surface. One of Rovik's wolves making contact with something solid, then a silence that was worse than the sound. "They are moving," Rovik said quietly. He shifted. It happened too fast for her eyes to track cleanly. One moment a man stood beside her table, and then there was a wolf. Gray-brown and built for endurance rather than size, his amber eyes retaining the focused intelligence of the person he had just been. He positioned himself between her and the door without being instructed to. Vera moved to the back of the cottage, pressing herself against the wall beside the cold fireplace, the blade in her right hand and one of the vials in her left, and waited. The first window shattered inward from her left. She was already moving when it happened, dropping below the trajectory of whatever came through, hitting the floor on her hands and knees, and coming up again in the same motion in the way that years of working in cramped, obstacle-filled healing spaces had made instinctive. Glass crossed the floor where she had been standing. Something small and dark embedded itself in the far wall at precisely the height her head had occupied. She looked at it without letting herself slow down. A dart. Slim, dark-feathered. The tip glistened. Not designed to kill quickly. Designed to incapacitate. To take her alive. Rovik's wolf form launched itself at the window with a snarl that vibrated the remaining glass in its frame. She heard the impact of wolf against wolf outside, heard the struggle immediately, and heard the weight and ground contact sounds that told her he was holding his own, but only barely. The front door held for 2 more breaths. Then it did not. The wood came inward in fragments, not kicked but torn, and the wolf that stepped through the gap was larger than Rovik and darker. Its black brindle coat carrying the silver-threaded markings that Vera recognized from the livery colors she had spent 3 years seeing in the Thornspire's corridors. House Dravath's wolves. It saw her immediately. Their eyes met across the width of the cottage, and it went absolutely still in the way of predators who have located their target and are calculating rather than pursuing, which was somehow worse than if it had simply charged. The vial in Vera's left hand was already unstoppered. Her free hand moved to her stomach, the instinct too deep and too old to override. The wolf took 1 step toward her, and from somewhere outside the cottage, from a distance that was closer than it had been 2 minutes ago and closing with a speed that did not seem physically possible, a howl split the winter air. Not Rovik's voice, something larger. Something so resonant with authority that it did not just travel through the air but through the ground, through the walls, through the bones of every wolf within its range. The Dravath wolf froze. Vera's fever detonated through her entire body at once, so total and so overwhelming that her vision went white at the edges, and she understood with absolute, wordless certainty exactly whose voice that was. The howl came again, closer still. And this time it sounded like a question with only one acceptable answer. The Dravath wolf did not move. That was what saved her. Not speed, not strength, not anything she had planned. The howl from outside hit the cottage like a physical force, and the wolf in her doorway responded to it the way every subordinate wolf responded to the voice of an alpha whose power outranked everything in its experience. Its haunches dropped fractionally. Its ears flattened. The calculating stillness of a predator became the involuntary stillness of a creature whose instincts were suddenly in direct conflict with its orders. 3 seconds. Perhaps 4. Vera used them. She crossed the distance between herself and the wolf in 4 steps and drove the silver-edged blade hard into the dense muscle of its left shoulder before it registered that she was moving. The compound she had unstoppered went directly against the wound in the same motion, not the wolfsbane derivative, which would kill, but the paralytic, which would not. She had calibrated it for large animal sedation. A shifted wolf was large. The calculation held. The wolf collapsed sideways with a sound like a felled tree. Vera stepped back and stood over it, breathing hard, and discovered, with some distant part of her mind, that was still capable of objective observation, that her hands were not shaking. That was new. Something had shifted in her in the seconds between the howl and the action. Some arrangement of interior furniture had rearranged itself without her permission. She had spent weeks in Caldmere telling herself she was hiding, surviving, waiting for things to resolve themselves without her active participation. She understood now, standing over an unconscious Dravath wolf in her destroyed cottage doorway with a silver blade in her hand, that she had not been surviving at all. She had been waiting to stop surviving and start something else, She stepped over the wolf and out through the ruined door. The scene outside was controlled chaos resolving toward order. Rovik's wolf form stood over a downed Drevath wolf at the cottage's eastern corner. One of Calder's advanced scouts, a pale-furred wolf she did not recognize, moving with the precise efficiency of someone who had done this before, was driving a retreating Drevath shape back toward the tree line at the cottage's northern edge. Somewhere deep in the Greyvale forest, she could hear additional movement closing fast. Vera looked down at her own hands. The warmth she had always attributed to the fever was coming from her palms. It had always come from her palms. She understood that now in a rush of recognition so complete, it felt like remembering something she had known before she was born. Every birth she had managed that went smoother than it should have. Every wound she had treated that closed faster than the herbals alone could account for. Every fever she had broken with what she had told herself was simply the right combination of compounds and timing. It had never been only the compounds. She had been told since childhood that she had no wolf, that the absence of a shift was an absence of the other half of her nature entirely. No one had ever suggested that the other half might have found a different expression, that it might have gone sideways instead of outward, turning inward into something that worked quietly and continuously, in ways that looked like skill rather than power, because skill was acceptable, and power in someone with no traceable bloodline and no pack standing was something else entirely. Vera pressed her glowing palms together and felt the warmth pulse between them like a heartbeat. From the direction of the forest, the sound of approach reached its crescendo. The tree line 30 yards from her cottage exploded outward, not with violence, with force. There was a difference. The branches did not break so much as yield, giving way for something that did not slow at the perimeter of the forest, because the perimeter of the forest was not something it recognized as a barrier. A wolf larger than anything she had seen outside of the old illustrated histories in the Thornspire's restricted archives crossed the open ground between the trees and her doorstep in a span of time that seemed to belong to a different set of physical rules than the ones she normally operated under. Black. So purely, absolutely black that the winter light seemed to fall into it rather than reflect off it. It stopped. 3 feet from where she stood with her glowing hands and her silver blade and everything she had spent months pretending she was not. The wolf's eyes were gold. Not amber. Gold. The saturated, blazing gold of a bond at full activation, burning with 3 months of accumulated urgency and the force of a power that had been holding itself in check at enormous cost for a very long time. It looked at her hands. It looked at her face. It looked at the barely perceptible change in her silhouette that she had been concealing under the loose winter clothes of a village healer named Mira, and it made a sound that had no name in any language she knew. Something between a question and an answer and an ending and a beginning, compressed into a single note that resonated in every part of her simultaneously. Vera's fever reached its absolute peak, and then, for the first time in 3 months, it went perfectly still. Not extinguished. Not defeated. Completed. He shifted. She had seen it happen to Rovik, the rapid, disorienting transition between forms that her mind still had not fully developed adequate processing for. But Calder's shift was different in the way that everything about him had always been different from what she was accustomed to. Not more dramatic, but more complete. As if the 2 forms were simply 2 available expressions of a single coherent identity, rather than 2 separate states of being. He stood before her in the winter light of her courtyard, in the clothes he had apparently been wearing when he shifted, which were substantially the worse for 3 months of territory-wide searching and 1 recent sprint through the Greyvale forest's outermost boundary. He was thinner than she remembered. The lines of his face had deepened in ways that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with sustained, unrelenting cost. His eyes were still gold. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and Vera understood from his expression that he was doing what she had done in the corridor of the Thornspire 6 months ago. memorizing, with the involuntary thoroughness of someone cataloging something they cannot afford to lose again. Then he looked at her hands, where the warmth had faded to a faint residual glow. Then he looked at her stomach. "Vera," he said. His voice carried the quality of something that had been pushed past its limits and had arrived at a register of careful control through sheer necessity. "How long?" It was not quite a question. "Nearly 4 months," she said. He closed his eyes. She watched the breath move through him, in and then out. Long and slow, with the quality of someone managing the distance between what they feel and what they can safely express in front of other people. Then he opened his eyes and looked at her again, and whatever he had managed to contain was not entirely contained, and she found she was not as prepared for the sight of it as she had believed herself to be. "Come inside," she said. They sat at her work table with the ruined door open to the winter air and the sounds of Rovik's wolves securing the perimeter outside, and for a while neither of them spoke. Vera poured water because it gave her hands something purposeful to do. Calder sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at them as if verifying they were his. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He told her about the morning 3 days after the ceremony when he had surfaced from the compound's grip to find a world that had been rearranged in his absence, the nauseating horror of discovering a bonding declaration bearing his signature for an agreement he had no memory of making. Valdis in the adjacent suite, already issuing instructions to the household staff as if the Thornspire were hers by long-established right. His counsel presenting him with the binding terms as fait accompli, their faces carrying the careful blankness of people who were unsure whether what they were looking at was their king or something wearing their king. He told her about going to the healing ward, about standing in the doorway of her empty chamber with the sensation of a floor that was no longer there beneath his feet. He told her about the weeks that followed in language that was spare and precise, and somehow worse for the precision. The systematic deployment of wolves across 3 territories, the daily reports that contained nothing, the slow erosion of the self-control he had spent his entire adult life constructing, because self-control required a stable interior architecture, and his had been gutted the morning he woke up to find her gone. He told her about the bond, how it had never gone quiet, how it pulsed at him in the darkness with the insistence of something that could not be convinced to accept what his eyes were telling it. How his wolf had spent 3 months at the edge of feral not because the bond was broken, but because it was not. Because whatever House Drevath had done to his mind had not touched the deeper connection that did not run through the mind at all. And his wolf knew she was alive and could not understand why they were not moving toward her fast enough. When he finished, the silence in the cottage was not empty. It was full. Of everything she had spent 3 months carrying alone. Vera set down the cup she had not drunk from. "I was in the gallery," she said. Calder went still. "The maintenance gallery above the ceremonial hall. I heard the summons bell and I went to see, and I watched the entire declaration from above." She kept her voice even with considerable effort. "I watched you take her hand. I watched you say the words. I watched Valdis look up at you with the expression of someone who had won a game they had been playing for a very long time. And then I went to my chamber, and I packed what I owned, and I left before dawn. Vera, I need you to understand what that was." She looked at him directly. "I was already carrying your child. I had known for 2 weeks. I had been deciding every day how to tell you, what words to use, how to say it in a way that communicated everything I wanted it to communicate." She paused. "And then I stood in that gallery and watched you choose someone else in front of every wolf of consequence in Arenthus, and I understood that the words I had been rehearsing were never going to be spoken, and I left." The gold in his eyes deepened. "I did not choose her," he said. The words came out with a force that had nothing to do with volume. "I would not. There is no version of that night, no argument, no political consequence, No pressure that any council or noble house or accumulated power in 3 territories could bring to bear that would make me choose anyone but you. What happened in that hall was not a choice. It was a theft. His jaw tightened. And I will spend whatever remains of my life accounting for the cost of what was stolen, if you will allow me to. Vera looked at him for a long time. She thought about the gallery, about the cold stairwell where she had sat after, about weeks of waking before dawn in a dead woman's bed with one hand on her stomach, accounting for everything alone. She thought about the fever, about what it had been telling her from the very beginning, if she had been willing to hear it. I am not easy to accommodate, she said finally. I do not have a wolf form. I have no family name. I have no standing in any of the structures that govern your world. Whatever we are to each other, it will complicate everything you have built. Good, Calder said. Everything I have built needed complicating. Before she could respond, Rovik appeared in the ruined doorway. His expression told her something had changed. My king. His voice was carefully neutral in the manner of someone delivering news they wish they did not have. A rider has just come from the Thornspire. Lord Drevath has moved. Lord Drevath, it emerged, had not been idle. In the 2 days since Rovik's departure from the Thornspire, the Drevath forces embedded within the castle had made their move with the efficiency of people who had been waiting for the precise moment when the Alpha King was occupied elsewhere, and his attention could not compensate for his physical absence. They had taken the lower castle corridors and sealed the healing ward. They had confined 16 members of staff who had been identified, through methods Vera did not ask about, as loyal to Calder rather than to the declared bonding. Among the 16 was Pella. The rider's message was succinct and written in Lord Drevath's own hand, which told her everything she needed to know about how certain he was of his position. The confined staff would be formally charged with conspiracy against the declared bonding agreement within 48 hours. The charges carried a sentence that was not ambiguous. Calder read the message once and handed it to Rovik without expression. But she could feel it through the connection between them, the bond that had never been completed, but had never gone dormant. The cold fury of a man who was calculating rather than reacting, which was somehow more frightening than reaction would have been. We ride at first light, he said. How many wolves do you have within reach? Rovik asked. Enough. Calder looked at Vera. You stay at the rear of the formation. You do not approach the castle walls until I tell you it is safe. Rovik's wolves will— Pella covered for me, Vera said. Calder stopped. For months. Every time I was somewhere I should not have been. Every time my absence from the ward needed an explanation. She covered for me without being asked, without being thanked, without knowing why she was doing it beyond the fact that it seemed like the right thing. She held his gaze steadily. She is in that ward because of choices that were made because of me. I will not stay at the rear of a formation while she pays for that. Vera. He kept his voice even with visible effort. You are nearly 4 months along with my child. The risk exists whether I stay at the rear or not, she said. House Drevath has already demonstrated that distance is not a protection. That letter found me in Caldmere. Those wolves found me in Caldmere. The only protection I have ever had was invisibility, and that is finished. The silence stretched. She is not wrong, Rovik said from the doorway. Calder looked at him with an expression that promised consequences. The beta did not appear significantly moved by this. They rode at first light. The Thornspire rose ahead of them as they crested the final ridge in the gray early morning, its ancient towers catching the first pale light and throwing it back without warmth. Vera had looked at it every day for 3 years without fully seeing it. She saw it now with the clarity of someone returning rather than arriving. All its beauty and all its weight simultaneously visible. The Drevath banner did not fly above it. That surprised her. He is not secure enough to fly his colors yet, Rovik said, following her line of sight. He has the castle but not the allegiance of the wolves inside it. He is managing a hostage situation, not a conquest. Which means he needs something to negotiate with, Calder said. Which means the hostages are still alive, Vera said. The battle for the outer gate was brief and decisive. Dravath forces held it, supplemented by mercenary wolves whose loyalty was to payment rather than bloodline, and who were therefore vulnerable to the calculation of what happened to people on the losing side of a confrontation with a sitting Alpha King. The inner keep was different. Lord Dravath had fortified the healing ward with the tactical instinct of a man who had been planning power consolidation for 3 decades. The ward had 1 main entrance and 2 service corridors, all 3 now sealed and defended by wolves who had made their choice and understood what that choice meant. The hostages were inside. Calder's wolves could breach the main door. They had the numbers and the strength for it. But a breach through a single doorway against prepared defenders, in a corridor where 16 non-combatants were present, the calculation was not clean. Vera did the calculation in the time it took to survey the outer ward and came to a conclusion she did not share with anyone until she had already begun walking toward the sealed main entrance. Vera. Calder's voice was very quiet behind her. There is a service access through the lower physics doors, she said without stopping. It does not appear in the castle's official plans. I found it my first year in the ward when I was looking for a place to store supplies that had nowhere else to go. Dravath's people would not know to seal it. She paused at the entrance to the lower stairwell. I know every person in that ward. I know how Pella thinks, how she manages a crisis, what she needs to hear to act on it. I can get them out of that room before your wolves breach the door. She turned to look at him. I am not asking for permission, she said. I am telling you what I am doing so that you can have your wolves ready at the main entrance for when the hostages come through it. Calder looked at her for 1 long second. Then he stepped forward, cupped her face in both hands and pressed his forehead against hers with a force that was not violence, but was not gentleness either. Something more necessary than either. If you are not out in 20 minutes, he said, very quietly, I will take that door apart with my hands. Vera covered his hands with hers briefly. Then she went through the lower stairwell and disappeared into the castle's oldest bones. She found the service access exactly where she had left it, behind a stack of empty storage crates that no one had thought to rearrange. She moved through corridors she knew by touch as much as sight, navigating the Thornspire's lower levels with the confidence of 3 years of daily familiarity, and arrived at the physics store's interior access to the healing ward. She pressed her ear to the door. She heard Pella's voice on the other side, calm and deliberate, explaining something to someone in the measured tone of a woman who had decided that panic was an unaffordable luxury and had arranged her interior landscape accordingly. Vera smiled despite everything. She unlatched the access door and pushed it open. The healing ward opened before her and she stepped through, and found herself face to face with Valdis of House Dravath, who had a blade in her hand and an expression that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this. How convenient, Valdis said softly. You have saved me the trouble of finding you. Pella saw her first. The older healer's eyes found Vera across the width of the ward with immediate focused attention, cycling through relief and calculation and warning in approximately 1 second, then settling into the composed stillness of a professional who had not survived 4 decades in service to difficult people without learning to perform calm in situations that did not merit it. 12 other hostages were in the ward. 4 Dravath guards occupied the corners. Valdis stood between Vera and the interior, the blade raised at a conversational height that communicated readiness without urgency. The complication arrives, Valdis said, as complication always does, without adequate preparation and slightly too late to matter. Vera catalogued the room without appearing to do so. The main entrance was sealed from outside. The 4 guards were positioned for surveillance of the hostages, not for pursuit of a single entrant through the service access, which meant Valdis had been stationed specifically at the physics store passage because she had known about it, or had calculated that someone familiar with the castle would use it. The blade between them was steady. "You understand what you are," Valdis said. Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who has arranged their understanding of a situation so completely that new information has nowhere to enter. A woman with no name, no bloodline, no standing in any structure that matters. A servant who mistook access for belonging. Whatever happened between you and my declared mate was an aberration that ends today. "He is not your declared mate," Vera said. "He was drugged and maneuvered into a declaration he was incapable of genuinely making. You know this. Your father knows this. The only people in Arenthus who believe that declaration is valid are the people whose positions depend on it being valid." Something moved in Valdis's eyes. Not doubt. Something harder. The defended quality of a person who has made choices they cannot unmake and must therefore justify without ceasing. "What I know," Valdis said, "is that you are alone in a sealed room with 12 hostages and 4 guards and a blade 6 inches from your heart, and the Alpha King is on the other side of a door that my father's wolves will hold long enough for this to be finished." She took one step forward. "Stand down. Come with me peacefully, and I will tell my father the hostages served their purpose and can be released." Vera did not stand down. She had not come this far, through Caldmere's winter and Calder's search, and the destroyed cottage door and the service corridor of her own history, to stand down at the finish. But she also did not reach for the blade at her side. Something else was happening. She became aware of it the way she had become aware of the glow in her palms the previous day. Not as a sudden onset, but as a recognition of something that had always been present and was only now being properly identified. It began in her lower body, a deep tidal pressure that had nothing to do with the pregnancy and everything to do with whatever the pregnancy had been slowly, steadily awakening in her. The dormant architecture of a nature she had been told she did not possess. She had no wolf, they had always said. But no one had ever explained what it meant that the fever had started the night she met Calder. What it meant that the healing power in her palms had always exceeded the compounds in her training. What it meant that the bond between them had pulsed and searched and refused to sever through 3 months of distance and grief and 1 Dravath drugging. No wolf form, they had said. But they had been measuring the wrong thing. The pressure built with a speed that was not controllable and was not meant to be controlled. Vera had one clear moment of understanding before it became irreversible. One moment in which she saw everything she had been and everything she was becoming and recognized both. And then the pressure crested, and the world went white and gold, and she stopped being only one thing. The shift of a wolf who has never shifted before is nothing like the shift of a wolf who has done it 1,000 times. It is total. It is the body discovering the full extent of itself for the first time, all at once, without graduated preparation. It filled the healing ward with light that was not fire, and heat that was not fever, and a sound that was not a howl, but contained everything a howl contained. The full registered existence of a creature announcing itself to the world after a very long silence. The 4 Dravath guards pressed themselves against the walls. Valdis dropped her blade. Pella stood from the floor where she had been seated, and her face, as she watched what Vera had become, was not the expression of someone witnessing something magnificent. It was the expression of an experienced healer watching something she could not stop and could only pray would not cost the child what the mother was giving. A first shift carried risk under any circumstance. A first shift while carrying a child had no precedent in any text Pella had ever studied, and the knowledge of that sat in her eyes like a held breath. The wolf Vera had become was the color of light through water, not white, not gold, something between and beyond both. It stood in the center of the healing ward and breathed, and every breath displaced air that carried the resonance of the bond at full ignition. And from the other side of the sealed main door, a sound answered it. The door came off its frame in a single motion. Calder came through it in human form, which was somehow more powerful than if he had come through shifted, the Alpha's full authority preceding him through the space like a pressure change. He crossed the ward in 6 strides, and the guards who might have moved against him chose, with the impeccable survival instinct of people who had just recalculated their odds, not to. He stopped before her. She shifted back, and the transition was nothing like the ordeal she had feared. It was as natural as breathing out after a long breath held. The wolf receding and leaving her standing in the ruins of her outer garments with her palms flat against the warm air and her eyes open and clear. Her first movement was her hands going to her stomach. She held her breath for 1 terrible second. Then she felt the answering movement beneath her palms, small, insistent, and entirely indignant at the disruption, and released the breath she had been holding since the transformation began. The child was furious and perfectly intact. Across the ward, she saw Pella close her eyes briefly and release a breath of her own. Calder looked at Vera with an expression that went so far past what words were designed to carry that language had the good sense to withdraw from the moment entirely. Then he turned to face Valdis. "Call your father's wolves off the outer gate," he said. "Now. And tell your father that the Alpha King of Arenthus requests his presence in the outer ward to discuss the terms of what happens next." Valdis looked at him for a long moment, watching the structure of her life's work come apart along every seam simultaneously. She went. When she was gone, Calder turned back to Vera. He tilted his head and bared the side of his neck, slow and deliberate and completely unambiguous. The gesture of a wolf who recognizes its equal and offers itself accordingly. "Complete it," he said quietly. "On equal terms. Your claim as much as mine." Vera understood what she was being offered. Not the traditional hierarchy, not the alpha claiming a mate who received and submitted. Equal. 2 wolves of equal standing, each claiming the other, neither above nor below. She stepped forward. She pressed her palm flat against his chest first, feeling his heartbeat. Fast, for all his composure. Then she pressed her lips to the side of his throat and felt his pulse beneath them, and claimed him the way the oldest bonds were sealed, before rank and bloodline and political structure had layered their requirements over the fundamental simple truth of it. His teeth found her shoulder in the same moment. The bond completed between one heartbeat and the next. Not an explosion, not the drama she might have expected. Something quieter and more total. 2 rivers that had been running parallel for a long time finally finding the confluence they had always been moving toward, and the discovery that the combined current was not twice as strong but 10 times, because the force had always been in the convergence rather than the individual streams. She felt him fully for the first time, not the searching pulse she had grown accustomed to. All of him, every thought, every cost, every grief, every fierce and unrelenting thread of the love he had been carrying for her through 3 months of impossible distance. He felt her in return. All of her. Caldmere, the gallery, the corridor. Everything she had been holding alone. They stood in the healing ward of the Thornspire with his wolves around them and the hostages free, and the Drevath forces standing down in the outer yard, and the winter light coming through the high windows. "My king," Pella said from across the room, with considerable composure for a woman who had just witnessed 2 events that would be recorded in Arenthus's oldest histories. "My lady healer," Calder answered, without releasing Vera. Pella looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Vera. Then she straightened her healer's apron with the dignity of someone who had waited a long time to say the next thing, and intended to say it correctly. "She is worth every complication she has ever caused, and the rest of them besides. I trust you are aware of this." "Fully aware," Calder said. Lord Drevath was brought before the assembled packs of Arenthus on a morning so clear that the light seemed to have opinions about events being conducted beneath it. He did not come willingly. He came with the diminished quality of a man who had built an ambitious structure on a compromised foundation, and was now watching it disassemble around him with the speed that such structures always eventually disassemble, faster than anyone planned for, and with considerably less dignity. The evidence was not sparse. The vial from the preparation room, the correspondence network that Rovik's intelligence contacts had been mapping for 11 weeks, which connected directly to the compound source and the specific servant in Drevath livery who had introduced it into the ceremonial wine. The letter recovered from Kaldmir's trader route, written in Drevath's own hand, ordering an elimination before the dark moon. The testimony of 3 Drevath wolves who had accepted a clemency arrangement in exchange for complete accounts of what they had been ordered to do and by whom. It was thorough. It was precise. It was the kind of evidence that left no usable gaps and was built by people who understood that power without proof is only delay. The assembled packs heard all of it. Lord Drevath was found guilty of bond violation, attempted murder of the Alpha's mate, conspiracy against the throne, and the corruption of a witness declaration. The sentencing was conducted according to the oldest terms of pack law, which predated the political structures Drevath had spent decades navigating and were not susceptible to the same manipulation. He was stripped of his territories, his titles, and his name. Valdis was exiled to the far western coast where Arenthis's territory ended and the open water began. She left without her silver hair carrying quite the same deliberate luster it had displayed in the Thornspire's great hall, and without looking back, which Vera thought was probably the first genuinely wise decision she had made in the entire affair. The compound's formula was destroyed. Every copy. Every secondary source the intelligence network could locate. The wolves who had manufactured it were dealt with under the pack law that covered deliberate bond interference, which was, Rovik explained with the satisfied precision of someone for whom this outcome had been a long time coming, severe enough to constitute a permanent deterrent. In the weeks following, the change spread outward through Arenthis, the way change rooted in something real always spreads. Not in announcements, but in gradual, pervasive shifts in the texture of daily life. The 3 packs in the Midlands that had been running feral came back to themselves over the course of 10 days. The pack bond network, which ran through the Alpha's bond as its primary node, had been partially destabilized by the contested bonding declaration for months. Its restoration began the morning after the completion in the healing ward and finished in stages, like a structure being re-inhabited room by room, until every pack in 3 territories reported that their wolves had settled and the night running had returned to its normal, purposeful patterns. The crops in the Thornspire Valley showed green before winter's last week ended, earlier than any recorded precedent in the agricultural histories, which the castle's chronicler noted with the careful neutrality of someone thinking things they intended to write down when no one was watching. Vera was formally acknowledged before the assembled nobility of Arenthis in a ceremony that was not long, because Calder had made clear to his council that elaboration for its own sake was not something he had patience for, and that the essential content of the acknowledgement was the point, not the ceremony surrounding it. The essential content was simple. She was his true mate. She had been from the beginning. The bond between them was older than any declaration, any house alliance, and any political calculation that had ever been made in the Thornspire's long history. And everything that followed from that fact was not new. It was a correction. Pella stood in the front row of the assembled witnesses with her hands folded and her expression carrying the settled satisfaction of someone who had been right for a very long time and had the grace not to make a large thing of it. She caught Vera's eye at one point during the acknowledgement and gave a single, small nod. Vera gave one in return. Summer had arrived in the Thornspire the way it always arrived, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small ones, each slightly more conclusive than the last, until one morning the air carried a warmth that belonged to the future rather than the past, and the decision was made without announcement. Vera's daughter arrived with the same quality. Not dramatically. Not with the crisis and fear that Vera had spent months steeling herself for. She arrived with the focused, efficient purposefulness of someone who had somewhere to be, and had decided the journey had gone on long enough. She was small and certain, and she opened her eyes immediately, which Pella said was unusual, and looked at the world with the considering attention of someone assessing whether it met their standards. Calder held her for the first time beside the window where the morning light came in from the east, across the valley where the crops had been green for weeks, and the expression on his face was the one Vera had seen in the gallery all those months ago. Not the hollow carved stone of the ceremony, but the real version, the one that had required such effort to contain in public and now required none at all. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, he said, "She has your eyes. She has your stubbornness," Pella said, from the doorway, where she had positioned herself with the authority of someone who had delivered a great many difficult births and intended to supervise the aftermath with equivalent care. Calder looked at Pella with an expression of mild challenge. Pella looked back with the unimpressed steadiness of a woman who had survived Lord Dravath's confinement, witnessed 2 unprecedented wolf events in a single day, and did not find a sitting Alpha King particularly intimidating by comparison. He looked back at the child. "She is going to cause a great deal of difficulty," he said, with the warmth of a person who finds this prospect entirely welcome. "Yes," Vera agreed. She reached across and he transferred the child to her arms with the careful, total attention of someone who has recently learned that careful and total attention is its own form of power. His hand came to rest beside her on the covers. She turned her hand palm up and he covered it with his. Through the bond, she felt him. Fully. The way she had felt him in the healing ward the moment the confluence completed. Not a pulse. Not a search. Not the desperate reaching of something incomplete. Just him, entirely present, the way a person is present when they have been trying to reach somewhere for a very long time and have finally arrived. She thought about the fever, about the night in the corridor when something in her blood had lurched awake and said, with absolute wordless certainty, "There." About the months of careful denial. About the gallery and the running and the dead healer's cottage, and the eastern lane where a traitor's voice had said the Alpha King's name and her entire constructed quiet had begun to fracture. "What will we call her?" Calder asked. Vera considered. "Sonara," she said, an old word from the oldest of the healing texts, from the chapters written in archaic language she had always been told was metaphor and had turned out to be instruction. It meant the warmth that precedes dawn, the heat that announces the light before the light itself arrives. Calder was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. Outside the Thornspire's high windows across the valley where green had returned to fields that had been gray all winter, a sound rose from the nearest pack settlement. A howl, long and clean, carrying the quality of something chosen rather than compelled. Another joined it from a different direction. Then more, dozens of voices, the sound spreading outward across Arenthus the way the bond had spread, the way warmth spreads, the way truth spreads, when it finally stops being obstructed. Vera listened to it with her daughter in her arms, and her mate's hand covering hers and the summer light coming through the window, and she understood that the fever, the one that had started in a corridor, the one that every healer in Arenthus had failed to name, the one that had burned through exile and grief and the long cold months of a life lived in hiding, had never been a fever at all. It had been a beginning. Everything before that corridor had been preparation. Everything after was the life they had earned. The wolves of Arenthus howled for a long time that morning. There was a great deal to say. Thank you so much for listening. If this story moved you, if it kept you up past the hour you intended to sleep, if you felt every heartbeat of this journey alongside Vera and Calder, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Until next time.